Happy Friday and welcome inside the Millvale Studios for this week's edition of Gike's Got Game. Coming at you from deep in the heart of Millvale, of course, I'm Matt Gike, your host, each and every Friday morning at 8 a.m., 8 to 9, live and then archived on riversedgepgh.com. We're on the live stream, we're on Facebook Live, we've got it all going on this Christmas Eve, if you will. Might be Festivus to some if you're a Seinfeld fan, and I, of course, am, and never pass up an opportunity to reference that legendary holiday. But no matter what you may be celebrating, thank you for spending some time in your holiday season with the River's Edge. Matt Gike flying solo with you this morning. Shout out to Brian Crawford, who's going through his own personal difficulties at the post office. It's a tough time to be working in that field, that's for sure. So miss his, of course, aptitude on the ones and twos over here producing the show, but we hope to have him back, not just doing this next week, but, of course, hosting his River Talk 3 times a week. Coming up later in this week's program, as we work our way down toward the bottom of the hour first, we're going to talk rivalries, and in a lot of ways, the word rivalry can be a cliche in sports, and I've been known to ban a few cliches, but in this case, I think it's an apropos topic. We have both the Steelers and the Penguins in rivalries, both real and possibly imagined at the moment, and the Penguins just went through a situation in Columbus, Ohio, where they may be developing a rivalry and something that has appeared to be percolating for a while. We'll see how that goes. As for the Steelers, this weekend is just the renewal of a feud against, of course, their good friends from Baltimore. But before we get into all that, which includes a breakdown of the Pirates' most surprising signing in quite some time, I didn't see this one coming. It just happened yesterday, Thursday morning, and also a preview of the upcoming Three Rivers Classic involving my beloved Robert Morris University men's hockey team, and we'll have some help with a analysis of that, a breakdown of the tournament, 5th annual holiday tournament. That is later on in the program. Also, ban the cliche and the final number, and if it's at all possible, I believe I have discovered the most Polish name ever created. I can't believe I wasn't aware of this name. As you may know from watching and listening to this show, I am quite Polish, 100% on both sides of my family, mom and dad, and I'm a third-generation American, don't get me wrong. That's what I associate more with is this country at this point. I've never even been over to the motherland, but I was taken aback by the sheer ethnicity of this name, and I'm kind of jealous of it, in fact. So that's coming up later on in the show. I mentioned the guest. Alan Saunders will be joining me, our most regular guest on Gike's Got Game. We'll be talking Pitt in search of a new athletic director. Also, as I mentioned, the Penguins, a rough night in Columbus, even though, as I alluded to as well, was an interesting night and something that may have implications going into the future. And let's not forget the Pirates in the midst of an offseason, which suddenly kicked into gear this week with a couple of new additions. And Alan, as always, the proprietor of Pittsburgh Hockey Digest.com or BurghHockey.com, you can find it at both places, will be covering the Three Rivers Classic from back to front to back. I'm Matt Gike. I am a reporter and analyst for DKPittsburghSports.com, and in addition to my duties here at River's Edge, where I host not only this show, but starting this month, Pens Overtime, a once-weekly Pens post-game show, if you will, which digs a little bit deeper into some of the numbers that I like to look at to indicate who has the better of play in a given game. But also, we do use the old-fashioned eye test. We talk both analysis, traditional and new school, on Pens Overtime. That's on the River's Edge, and that is typically the first game of a week. We were live on Tuesday night after the Penguins walloped the Rangers 7-2, and, well, they had the touchdown dropped on them in inverse fashion Thursday night in Columbus. So I picked the winning night, if you're a Penguins fan, and if you watched or listened to the show, or if you're watching or listening to this show, you probably are. But it's been fun discussing the Pens in a post-game format. Bob Grove was my guest 2 weeks ago when the Pens beat the Bruins in overtime. Ryan Wilson, Gunnar Stahl on Twitter of HockeyBuzz.com, was with me on Tuesday. But enough promos, enough reminders. Again, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. Matt Gike is my name, MattGajtka. Let's get into this week's show. And this week's first period focuses in on rivalry and the concept of that. And I mentioned it can be used and abused in the sports lexicon. But I believe the best rivalries are born naturally, not created in a lab, so to speak. Part of the reason that Steelers-Ravens, which will have its latest edition Sunday afternoon, Christmas Day showdown at Heinz Field. Part of the reason that has been so compelling is that out of the 15 years, counting this season, since the AFC North was established, one of these two teams, Steelers or Ravens, have won the division 11 times. The Steelers have done it 7 times, gunning for an 8th, of course. A win Sunday would cinch that. And this year's race will come down to head-to-head, in all likelihood, because the Steelers lost the opening matchup of the season series, a 2-gamer as always, in Baltimore in early November. And so that has put them in the position where they need to win this if they want to be in the driver's seat for Week 17, the final week of the season against the Cleveland Browns. That game may not mean anything to the Steelers beyond playoff seeding if they do defeat Baltimore this weekend. But if they don't, then the Ravens will not only have the head-to-head tiebreak, which is the first one. They'll have won the season series 2-0. They'll also have the in-division tiebreaker, as the Ravens have yet to lose in the AFC North, believe it or not, despite being a game back of the Steelers. Steelers at 9-4, the Ravens at 8-5. 8-6. Steelers at 9-5, I should say. So it's a 1-game lead, no matter what the actual numbers might be. But a 1-game lead with 2 to play for the Steelers. That's pretty good. Not quite dormy, to use a golf term, but they are in a great position. However, it could all swing, and football is like that, isn't it? It changes so quickly. There's only 16 games in the NFL, college even fewer, high school even fewer. So the end of the week has such importance, though. That one game, 60 minutes of play in the NFL and college, that's what it comes down to, and the swings are huge, and that's why I think football fans can be so emotional after games. Hey, I've been there too. Even though I always took pride in being a little more analytical, I understand what's at stake here. Steelers-Ravens, though, if we can have a bit of a history lesson, was, of course, enhanced by a remarkably physical, some might say brutal, I would say brutal, brand of football, at least for a while, culminating in the 2008-09 AFC Championship game at Heinz Field that was particularly uncomfortable to watch, at least for me. You might remember Willis McGahee being knocked out cold. I thought the man was dead, no hyperbole, on the field after a crass collision, and one of many collisions that night. Frigid evening. It had everything that NFL football purports itself to be. Some scoring, some defense, also built on a foundation of physicality, and as I mentioned, brutal physicality, and somewhat reminiscent of the Roman Colosseum, and that's why I got a bit squeamish watching that one. You wonder exactly what's it all for when guys are being knocked out left and right, which was the case on that evening down at the Confluence. But I digress. Even though I thought football might have gone too far that night, overall, that type of game is what has made Steelers-Ravens very special. Also, there's the trash-talking aspect. You might recall going back a few years, Shannon Sharp calling Plexigo Burress plexiglass. That's just one of many salvos fired back and forth between these two sides off the field, let alone on the field, if we only were privy to what was going on and what's said between the lines. But we aren't, so we have to deal with what's made public via reporters and the media, and, well, there's been plenty there. You don't even have to know what's going on. You can project at least a little bit. So even though the Ravens have won 4 in a row and 6 of 7, it's still a vibrant feud. It's still something that both fan bases look forward to, and, well, in this case, you don't need any extra ginning up. I don't care if the Steelers were playing the Houston Texans or pick your other nondescript team that doesn't have any past with the Steelers. It would be huge because there would be the chance for the Steelers, at least, to lock up one of those guaranteed playoff spots, of which there are 8 in the NFL, and then that would leave the Ravens hunting for a wild card. But even though the rivalry has turned rather purple over the past 3 years, including a playoff win for the Ravens at Heinz Field a couple of years ago when Le'Veon Bell was out. You might recall that one. Typically, these games are within a score by the end. And even the last one, which was 21-0 Ravens going into the fourth quarter at M&T Bank Stadium in early November, the Steelers rallied with what some might call garbage time touchdowns, but they got a couple to make it 21-14. And so there was suspense, even against the odds there. So not a created rivalry for Steelers-Ravens. It has been born organically. It goes back to the days of the old AFC Central. If you want to really dig in, it probably goes back to the fact that the Ravens are the Cleveland Browns, the old version of the Cleveland Browns, at least. And when Cleveland moved its franchise to Baltimore, yes, a lot was lost, and the new Browns have never quite reached the level of competitiveness that the old Browns did when they were going back and forth with the Steelers, especially in the 80s and early 90s. And some might recall, some might forget, in fact. Some might not have even been alive in the 80s when the Browns had the upper hand in that matchup. But things have certainly turned in terms of Pittsburgh-Cleveland. So Pittsburgh-Baltimore is the biggest rivalry, and it is, well, certainly right up there in terms of Pittsburgh sports. I don't know if it surpasses Penguins-Flyers. That's a story for another time, but the Penguins are working on perhaps creating some emotion between themselves and another opponent that is in their division, that is in their league, and that they see quite often. The Columbus Blue Jackets. The Jackets crushing the Penguins 7-1 Thursday night at Nationwide Arena in Ohio's capital city. And it looks like the Jackets are working on creating a toehold in what they hope will be a long-lasting battle with the Penguins at the top of the Metro Division. The Jackets, coached by the irascible John Tortorella, of course, have won 11 consecutive after wiping out the Pens last night. The Jackets were marooned in the Western Conference for the first decade plus of their existence, but now they have their geographic rival in their building at least twice per season, and that was the case last night. And excuse me, but if you watched it, if you were in the house, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like on the TV side, judging from the Root Sports broadcast, that this was the most Columbus-heavy crowd of any in the regular season history between these two teams. Always, before last night, the Penguins fans traveled well, and in some cases it's been as close to 50-50 as you can get in a road venue. But you go back to the playoff matchup, a 6-game series between these two teams 3 seasons ago, 3 springs ago. And boy, has time flown there. That was Dan Bilesma's last year in charge. The Jackets giving the Penguins all they could handle in a 6-game win for the Pens. And that Game 6 in Columbus was particularly memorable because the Penguins went out to a 3-0 or 4-0 lead. Yevgeny Malkin had a hat trick. It appeared to be all but over. But then the Jackets came back with 3 goals in the third and nearly tied it up. Boy, was that close. And if that series goes 7 games, I'm not sure how the Penguins handle that winner-take-all matchup at what was then called Consol Energy Center. But that was the initial seeding for the rivalry. Yes, getting Columbus into the Eastern Conference, which that franchise desired so much, was massive there too. The Penguins and the Jackets are the two closest teams, or the closest teams to each other on the NHL map, so it only makes sense that they're both in the same division. It was a fluke of the NHL's divisional and conference structure that they weren't for the first, 15 or a little bit less years that the two teams were in the league together. Columbus coming into the NHL in 2001, and it wasn't until 2013-14, so 13 years with the two teams separated by just a couple of hundred miles on Interstate 70 in different conferences and playing each other in some cases as little as 1 time a year. That was ridiculous. That's been alleviated, but the Jackets have to be competitive to go up against the Penguins, who it looks like will be at or near the top of the Metro and competing for Stanley Cups for the foreseeable future. And with the Jackets making a move and in this strong Metro, they're at the top right now, by the way. They passed the Penguins for the top spot with that win last night, and they have games in hand. The CBJ, appear to be game to give the Penguins quite a fight. And in talking to my DK Pittsburgh sports colleague Josh Yohe, who's covered the Penguins for a decade now, whether it be for the Trib or for our website, the crowds are lively at Nationwide. It's more of a college atmosphere. You can sense that too. A lot of chanting, more energy throughout the game, and easy to keep your energy up when your team wins by 6. I'll admit that. But even in that Game 6 going back a couple of years, I recall just how loud that crowd was, and Josh told me that that was the loudest he's ever heard a crowd. And that's saying a lot. He's been in some crazy buildings. Montreal, which is renowned for its crowd support. The Penguins have played them in the playoffs going back to 2009-10 when Montreal knocked them out in an upset. But Columbus had the loudest crowd that Josh has ever experienced. Yes, it's a subjective measure, but I think one that tells a big story. So it's a hidden gem of a market. Columbus doesn't have any other Major League Pro teams. They have the Columbus Clippers of the International League in baseball. But as far as pro teams go, the Jackets are on top, and it's an Ohio State town. It always will be. But in the winter and into the spring, the Jackets have an opportunity to carve out a niche in that market. And with more games like last night's, with more results like they've had recently, undefeated in regulation in December, then that's an opportunity to get themselves at least close to level footing with the Penguins. And there's a long way to go in that area, but I feel it's closer to happening than not at this point. And that's good for not just the Penguins, who, of course, could always use a little more emotion in their games. That's always fun over the course of a long 82-game NHL season. Now we're circling, or at least I am, those matchups with the Jackets. But for Columbus, and a team that has had difficulty finding its footing in the NHL over its now 16 seasons, working on a 17th in the league, this would be a godsend, and they know it. They're always measuring themselves against the Pens, and after last night, the measuring stick is very gracious to Columbus. So for a while, for the first couple of seasons with the Penguins and Jackets in the Metro, it appeared to be a bit of a manufactured rivalry, but now it's getting closer to a real one, and I think we're all the better for it. You're watching Gike's Got Game or listening to Gike's Got Game on our live stream at riversedgepgh.com. When I return, my guest Alan Saunders of Pittsburgh Hockey Digest, the Associated Press, Beaver County Times, Pittsburgh Sports Now, the list goes on and on. We'll be talking a wide variety of topics. Pittsburgh's most diverse sports reporter, Alan, will be on the show once again when we come back from this break. Again, you are watching Gike's Got Game on the River's Edge.
Stay clear of the streets, for God's sake! The timid and the fearful drivers are every bit as bad as the aggressive drivers. Nobody in Pittsburgh knows what a right-of-way is. I go down the road and I just sing this song, the gas is on the right, the gas is on the right, hi-ho the highway, yo! The gas is on the right.
Get educated with Brian Crawford live Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge.
Back for the second period on Gike's Got Game. I'm your host, Matt Gike, coming from you from the Millvale studios, and it's terrific to be with you once again on a frigid Friday morning, Christmas Eve, if you will, and thank you for spending part of your holiday season with us at the River's Edge. I mentioned at the start of the show that I have discovered the most Polish name ever, and it comes from a story on Pitt's search for a new athletic director, or at least Pitt looking and watching as their old athletic director, Scott Barnes, moves on to Oregon State. And I quote from my colleague Lance Lysowski's story: "No athletic director has spent at least a decade at Pitt since Kazimierz Myslinski held the position from 1968 through 82. Kazimierz Myslinski. I have never encountered that name before, but that strikes me as the most Polish name ever created, and I'm jealous that I am not named Casimir. I've always aspired to being a little more ethnically oriented than most, and I'm just flabbergasted by that one. I'm not sure scientists can cook up a more Polish name than that, and that's pretty Pittsburgh, I would have to say. Kazimierz Myslinski in the history of Pitt ADs. That is, or was, news to me when I read as I mentioned, Lance Lysowski's story on Pitt needing a new athletic director. The man on the other end of the guest line right now also covers Pitt in addition to the Pirates for Pirates Prospects, other sports in the area, including local hockey for Pittsburgh Hockey Digest. It's the Berg Hockey Now, or berghockey.com, I should say. I'm getting my URLs confused. Also, Alan writes on Pitt for Pittsburgh Sports Now. So there you go, tying it all together. Alan Saunders is on the line, and Alan, again, I'm still flabbergasted by Casimir there. That was quite the discovery.
The vaunted Myslinski years, as they are known.
That was a long tenure too, back in the day when this type of job didn't get turned over that much.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of surprises me that that name hasn't come across my desk more than once. But yeah, I mean, I think that lack of tenure in college athletics is certainly more than just a Pittsburgh and a University of Pittsburgh issue.
That doesn't really make Pitt fans feel any better about Scott Barnes leaving, though, the realities of college athletics. Scott Barnes, a West Coast guy, so you get that from a family standpoint, and that appears to be the angle that Pitt Chancellor Patrick Gallagher is taking and getting his arms around this and moving on. Scott Barnes was named Pitt Athletic Director in April 2015, so he doesn't even complete 2 years. He replaced Steve Peterson, and so 20 months is the tenure for Scott Barnes, and you've covered Pitt for a great deal of that time. What do you think the legacy of Barnes will be? He has made moves to reestablish rivalries in both football and basketball. That's what I see from the outside. But is that what you will take away the most as a reporter who has covered Pitt?
Yeah, I think the willingness to play the traditional rivals, and I think you could sort of combine that along with going back to the script Pitt logo. And the football team also wearing those throwback colors this year. It's just sort of an altogether re-embracing of the history of the program and not just a focus on the here and now.
So with Barnes moving on, does Pitt have to change its search process, or is this just a reality, as you said at the top? Is this just a reality of being in big-time college sports, and Pitt is certainly there in the ACC, but not quite to that top-tier program either? So is this simply a fact of life for the Panthers and the athletic program?
Yeah, I don't know if every 20 months is necessarily a fact of life, but I do think that just the reality of if you want to hire the best people in college athletics right now, then that means you're going to turn people over. And that happens at Pitt, and that happens at Ohio State, and that happens at Alabama. It doesn't really matter. And I think there's always this sort of groundswell, if you will, for people with Pittsburgh connections
yes.
or Pitt connections when jobs like this come open. And I just think you're in the long run, you're probably better served with having the most qualified individual, even if you have to have an extra one of them over a 10 or 15-year span, than necessarily finding someone that has the right name on the diploma or the right zip code in their address. So, yeah, I mean, in some places you can find that sweet spot. You can find a guy like Barry Alvarez of Wisconsin, was a longtime football coach, a natural fit, and a guy who will probably be athletic director for a long time at Wisconsin. Sometimes you can find that guy. Sometimes you can't, and I think that's just how it goes.
Barry Alvarez, by the way, Burgettstown, Pennsylvania native, so that's not too far from where I grew up in Weirton, West Virginia, and just about a half an hour from Pittsburgh. But he's not available right now, so the Panthers are going to have to look elsewhere. Just on the quick glance, Alan, do you feel that Barnes was a successful AD? He had one major hire, and that was Kevin Stallings as head basketball coach. Of course, he's just getting started, so tough to tell on that. But what's your feel on that situation?
Yeah, I think it's hard to sort of evaluate Barnes without talking about Kevin Stallings, because that is kind of the one big personnel move that he did make. But I think on the whole, most of the rest of the things we talked about with the schedule, the uniforms, the logo, just the willingness to be transparent and interested in embracing the history of the program, the things that fans really care about. I think those all have to be considered big long-term positives when you compare where Pitt is now from where it was nearly 2 years ago. But yeah, I mean, an athletic director is going to be judged on the value of the coaching hires, and the big one that Barnes made is Kevin Stallings, and that's obviously a hand that hasn't been played out yet. But I think that sort of no matter what Kevin Stallings ends up doing, I think you could tell that wasn't a hire that a lot of people were on the same page with. That wasn't a hire that was in the direction that a lot of fans were thinking that the basketball program needed to go. And so I just think in that very aspect alone, it wasn't a good hire. Now, if Kevin Stallings turns out to be a pretty good basketball coach, maybe it's okay. But I think that was sort of when the cracks appeared in what was otherwise a pretty solid-looking resume from Scott Barnes in his tenure as Pitt athletic director.
So last Pitt thing before we move on. What's the biggest first goal? You always talk about the incoming president in the United States has his or her 100 days, first 100 days in the office and the priorities there. What would be the first 100 days plan? Just one thing, one priority for the next Pitt AD.
There's not like a big, giant, crisis level issue. To me, the biggest thing for the new AD is the relationship with Pat Narduzzi. Mm-hmm. I think that it's very difficult to point to many negatives to Pat Narduzzi's time at Pitt, and most of the positive momentum that the program has gained over these last couple of years can pretty much be directly attributed to him. And so whoever the new AD is going to have to work with Pat Narduzzi. They're going to have to get on the same page. And sometimes there's that awkward stage when the new athletic director comes in and they inherit coaches they didn't hire, and maybe priorities aren't necessarily in order. I'm not sure Pitt's in a position where they can really afford to go through a real awkward transition there. So I think, to me, the biggest thing is the new AD comes in lockstep with Narduzzi and continues the momentum that the football team has built through his first two seasons.
And Pat Narduzzi knows all about the travails of course, being in Division I and having turnover. His offensive coordinator, Matt Canada, leaving for LSU after the Pinstripe Bowl coming up next week against Northwestern. So it's part of the deal, but Pitt has gone through quite the revolving door in leadership, especially at the top of the athletic program over the past couple of seasons. Scott Barnes out to Oregon State, and Pitt left to figure out who will lead the program next. Moving on to hockey. Alan, let's start with the Penguins. Last night at Columbus, I thought an opportunity to get an idea of where this burgeoning rivalry perhaps stands, as I talked about in the opening segment today. The Pens get destroyed 7-1, even though they had a solid first period. I thought things were on even terms, but Columbus really took over, puck possession, and of course putting the puck in the net. And John Tortorella's squad has won a franchise record 11 consecutive games, and they're at the top of the Metro Division. Didn't see this one coming, and that has been something I've been trying to get my head around for the last couple of weeks as the Jackets have risen. What are they doing differently this year? What did you see from last night's game that made you feel like this could be a different Jackets team?
Yeah, I think that they've sort of embraced the kind of hockey that the teams that are in that top echelon of the NHL have been playing for a couple of years now. And I think it's really interesting because I think when you look at Pittsburgh or when you look at Chicago, I think it's very easy from an outsider's perspective to say, well, it's one thing to play like that when you're Pittsburgh or Chicago because they have Sidney Crosby, they have Kane and Taves, and they have those talented players that everyone can see the immediate results of playing an aggressive, quick forecheck kind of direct hockey. But John Tortorella is doing it without big superstars. And to me, I think that's great because it's sort of, I hope anyway, I mean, if you look at Columbus's roster and you're a head coach somewhere else in the league, how do you not say, well, I got to do what they're doing? It's not like Columbus has players that nobody else has. And so I think it's a great thing. They're getting outstanding goaltending right now. And that's part of it. You can't – it's really difficult to be so aggressive if you're not getting the saves on the back end. There's just that natural tendency as a player and as a coach from a macro level or a micro level to just be less aggressive when there's less confidence in what's going on in your own crease. But I just think the combination of a very aggressive mindset and great goaltending has really freed that team up. And I think it's great. I mean, when was the last time you saw too many 7-1 outcomes one way or the other throughout the course of a hockey season? And Columbus has been on the end of a couple of those this season, and I think it's great.
They've also won 10-0 over Montreal, too. So they've put up some scores. Credit to them. And as I said earlier in the program, again, it's good for the NHL, great for Columbus if the Jackets take off. And I think more fun for Penguins fans, too. Get an extra bit of a rivalry matchup going 4 or 5 or maybe more times a year if they meet in the playoffs. Do you see potential still in Derek Pouliot, Allen, or do you see a player who is always going to have a rough time adapting to the speed of the NHL? Because I'm starting to lean toward the latter. I know he hasn't played a full season, not anywhere close in the NHL, but every time he gets an opportunity, I find myself a little bit nonplussed with not his skill set, but just how it translates out there on the ice. I know he can play, I know he can move the puck, and that's the way the Penguins like to have it on their back end, but something's not connecting for him.
Yeah, I've always been a little bit on the skeptical side about the way his game was going to translate to the NHL, and I still feel that way. I just don't see a player that engages in the defensive end of the defensive side of his position enough to compensate for some just questionable decision making at times. He's not the fastest player. It just doesn't quite seem like a package where it all adds up into a player that's the top 4 NHL defensemen. I think there can be some value in being a bottom pair guy that can move the puck as opposed to being, just some plug back there. And maybe he needs to go somewhere where he can be that guy for 80 games a season without a lot of eyeballs or pressure on him to do much more than that. And maybe it works out for him. But I'm starting to think that's not going to happen in Pittsburgh at this point. At least that's the way it looks to me.
Last thing on the Penguins, how do you feel on how the goalie situation has played out? Matt Murray, not a solid week, really. I thought he gave up a couple of soft ones against the Rangers the other night, and then he was just one of many issues for the Penguins on Thursday. But he is getting the lion's share of the playing time, almost 2 for 1 since both have been healthy, compared to Marc-Andre Fleury's playing time, who we assume will start Friday against the Devils in the Penguins' final game before the 3-day Christmas break. But is this the right way to go about it for Jim Rutherford and Mike Sullivan to try to see what they have in Matt Murray? I think it is. I think you have to give him more playing time because at this stage of the game, in my opinion, and when you look at the numbers, I think it's the case too. Marc-Andre Fleury is a known commodity, but Matt Murray still hasn't played a full NHL season, much like Derek Pouliot. He's had a lot more success than Derek Pouliot, but if you need to make an evaluation, then you need more information, and I fully endorse with the way that the Pens are going about it with their goalies. How do you feel on it?
Yeah, I think to me, the big thing is that Murray has grown, in my eyes, from the goaltender that we saw in the postseason last year. And I think that's a huge deal. And as long as he continues to show growth in places that I thought there were some pretty obvious spots where he needed some work, despite the great playoff run and insane statistical success, there were just some things that you could look at and say, well, that needs to be better. And I think he's gotten better. And I think that's, to me, the as long as Murray is playing well and continuing to progress in that role, then I think that's about as good as the Penguins can hope for this situation to go, right? I mean, it's not going to be pretty for somebody's playing time pretty much no matter what. And like you said, Fleury is at this point very much a known commodity. If they're getting high-level goaltending out of Murray, then I think that's pretty much a win no matter how you kind of, divvy it up, whether it was 2-1 or 50-50. I don't know. I guess you could make a case for a little bit more playing time for Marc-Andre Fleury here or there, but I think that's pretty much nitpicking at this point. I think the Penguins have done a pretty good job, and I think it's shown in the fact that Fleury's numbers are still pretty good, and that Murray has shown growth at the same time.
Every time Alan Saunders comes on the show, I like to plug his website, berghockey.com, pittsburghhockeydigest.com. Both will take you to the same place. The site covers everything Pittsburgh hockey except for the Penguins. So you've got Robert Morris, D1 hockey, men's and women's down at the Island Sports Center. You've got PIHL high school pucks, and you have a podcast. You have some photos from your our good friend, Brian Mitchell, and a host of contributors. You can find it all there. Alan, it'll be a big moment for Robert Morris. Men's hockey, as always, at the holiday time. The 5th annual Three Rivers Classic is coming up. RMU carries a record of 9-6-3, 7-5-2 in Atlantic Hockey Conference into the Classic. Of course, conference play thrown out the window for the next couple of games. It's all non-conference stuff down at PPG Paints Arena, and I will say tickets still available. I think it's a great showcase of what college hockey can be, especially so this year with a couple of ranked teams. Boston College, top 10, Quinnipiac, top 20, coming in. They'll play each other in the opener next Thursday. Thursday and Friday, 29th and 30th, are the 2 dates for the Three Rivers Classic this year. And the Colonials will host Ferris State, who is having a bit of a down year, but another storied hockey program that will come in for the Classic. The Colonials are coming off a close-fought weekend against Mercyhurst, a couple of overtime games, 1 loss and 1 tie. I mentioned the record. Bobby Moe on the outside looking in terms of the pairwise rankings, which will determine the NCAA tournament field at the end of the regular season in a couple of months. But how do you feel they stack up in this tournament? Forget the long view. How do they look in this one coming up? I mentioned another 2 games against non-conference foes on the Penguins' home ice.
Well, they're not playing maybe the best hockey they've played all season, but they certainly have taken some pretty significant strides from where they were at the beginning of the year. I think the goaltending situation has really played in their favor. They've essentially got close to 3 now with Dalton Isaac close to coming back that are all playing really well. And I think when you're talking about a tournament like this where most teams like to play 2 goaltenders, that's an advantage. And just, for whatever reason, Robert Morris throughout the last 5-10 years hasn't been very, very fazed by the team with the low number in front of them in the rankings department. It doesn't seem like that's been a big issue. They came in and beat Penn State. They beat UMass Lowell a year ago. That they'd beaten the highly ranked Ohio State team this year. They beat Michigan a year ago. Going back a few years ago, there were some big wins over Notre Dame and Miami when both of those teams were in the top 5. So I think this is one of those things where you kind of throw out the record a little bit. Robert Morris has been very good in this tournament, been very good in the home ice of the Pittsburgh Penguins over the years, especially when playing really highly ranked opponents, and they're going to get at least one of those, and Boston College or Quinnipiac. And Ferris State should be a tough test as well.
the only time in the history of the Classic when I thought RMU gave less than its best. Not voluntarily, of course. They just seemed burned out a couple of seasons ago when they played ranked Colgate in the final. Colgate smoked them, I believe it was 6-1. The shots on goal were very indicative of that final score, too. That came after the Colonials, then ranked 19th in the USCHO poll, defeated number 20 Penn State, and Penn State was always a big meeting, and that was always an emotional matchup. That was a back-and-forth game and ended up going in the Colonials' favor. And in fact, the Colonials beat Penn State again last year to reach the championship, and then they won it in the end. So they've won this thing 2 times. They've been in the championship game 3 times total out of 4 years. That's pretty good stuff, even considering that it's not technically a home tournament for RMU. The Penguins are the host officially, but it is still a lot more of a comfort zone for them than it is for the visitors. So we've seen a lot of good from RMU. And Alan, this is the first tournament, before I let you go, first tournament in the history of this Classic in which Penn State will not participate. Does this event need another team to move the needle, another so-called co-host like Penn State might have been perceived to be over the first 4 years of the tournament?
It does to me, because it's going to be very difficult for Robert Morris to continue to book extremely good hockey teams that are going to want to play each other in that opposite semifinal in that first game. That there aren't a lot of teams like Boston College and Quinnipiac that are going to want to go play a non-conference game in Pittsburgh over Christmas break. And so then when in the years when you don't have the name recognition sort of at the top of the card, I guess, if it were, like a Boston College and a Quinnipiac, then to be able to fall back on the rivalry and the fan base of a team like Penn State was something that I thought made the Classic a tournament that I thought could last with Penn State in it for a very long time. Without them, I'm not sure. I guess we'll see what the attendance is like this year. I expect it to still be at a high level, considering who's coming into the city and Boston College and Quinnipiac, but it certainly makes it a challenge going forward to fill that tournament with 3 other good teams, to make it a draw, and to make it worthwhile for the teams to play in from a scheduling and a pairwise perspective.
Alan Saunders has been our featured guest on this edition of Gike's Got Game. Alan, always great to talk with you, and I'm sure I will see you down at PPG Pates next week. I'll have the coverage for DK Pittsburgh Sports. You'll have it for your own site, Pittsburgh Hockey Digest, berghockey.com. Have a great holiday, and I'll see you on the other side.
You do the same, Matt, and enjoy the first one with the little guy.
Yes, little Lucas will be enjoying his first. He's already had quite a few Christmas celebrations with various aspects of the family, various parts of the family. One more won't hurt this weekend. That's Alan. I'm Matt. I will return in just a little bit. Until then, enjoy some local music right here on the River's Edge.
Hey folks, it's Mike Sasson. Just so you guys understand, if there's one thing I do better than anybody I know, it's talk about nothing for an hour. Want proof? Here's the proof. The Mike Sasson Show. It's going to be on from 10 a.m. to 11 every Tuesday starting July 19th. It's an hour that you'll never get back. Neither will I, so we'll have that in common. Here on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
Third period Gike's Got Game, final period Gike's Got Game. Let's put a bow on it, shall we, for this Friday, December 23rd, 2016, the second to last show of the year for me. And it's been a wonderful year, my first full year at the River's Edge. And as I mentioned at Thanksgiving, very grateful to have the opportunity. Thanks to Brian Crawford, Tom Benoit, Sarah Kramer for all that they have done to make this station a success so far. We continue to grow in terms of numbers and also the content. You can see all the shows that we have available in addition to some random stuff too that pops up every now and again at riversedgepgh.com. That's riversedgepgh.com. No apostrophe. That doesn't work in URLs in case you're new to the internet. This is a new kind of radio, and I like to think that this is a new kind of sports talk. Not that we deviate too far from the norm in that area, but the subject matter, I like to keep it various. I like to keep it fresh, and it's always a credit to our guests for coming on and aiding in that task. Alan Saunders did that just a moment ago. My good friend and former colleague, and well, he continues to have plenty on his plate with Pittsburgh Sports Now, covering Pitt football, Pinstripe Bowl coming up next week, plus freelancing for the Associated Press, Beaver County Times, and he's got his own baby now, Pittsburgh Hockey Digest, to keep him busy in the winter, in addition to his summertime work and springtime work with PiratesProspects.com. Much like DKPittsburghSports.com, it is a pay site, subscription site, trying to change the model. A lot of us are in this industry that had gone astray for quite some time and tried to ruin the business by giving stuff away for free. Tough to put that genie back in the bottle, but I think quality content gets the job done no matter what the format, no matter what the requirement might be to access it. And we are happy to be on the air 24/7 here at the River's Edge. And as I wrap up this week's show, I'd like to go back to last night's game, Penguins Jackets again. I hate to obsess over this one too much, and I'm trying not to, but the Penguins dropping their road record to a very interestingly mediocre 7-6-3. They are below 500 if you count overtime losses as losses, which I really don't. I don't know what to do with them. In fact, it's a tough situation in the standings when you just talk about traditional winning and losing records. I'm not sure you can even play that game in the sport of hockey with the way that points are handed out instead of having wins and losses be the end-all be-all. But be that as it may, I thought Mike Sullivan got away from what one of his team's strengths are last night, and I'm talking about the dressing of Steve Oleksy, noted warm body from the American Hockey League's Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins, over Chad Ruhwedel, who I thought, and I mentioned this on Penn's Overtime a couple of nights ago, was quite good in his Penguins debut. He's played before for the Buffalo Sabres, has Chad Ruhwedel, and I saw him as a better fit for what the Penguins are trying to accomplish. As I mentioned with Alan about Derek Pouliot, the Penguins are a team that needs puck movers on the back end, and especially with both Chris Letang and Trevor Daley out. And I neglected to mention that as a factor in the decision, the lopsided decision Thursday night in Columbus. Without Letang especially, and Daley as well, to move the puck up ice to get the breakout started, the Penguins are much diminished, and I think you need as much of that talent as possible in the lineup in any case, let alone when your top two are out. And I thought Chad Ruhwedel would have been a good fit to go with, but it seems like Mike Sullivan dressed Steve Oleksy, who's really only skill is to play the physical game, but in doing that, I think he capitulated what the Jackets are trying to do with their forecheck. And Oleksy doesn't have great puck skills, to put it mildly, at least as far as the NHL level goes. And anytime the Penguins go with a player whose primary value is combating physicality, or whatever Oleksy was supposed to be in there doing last night, that's strange to me. This team needs to attack in waves, not have some misconstrued sense of balance between skill and grit, if you will. The Pens went the other way with that, and went the wrong way with that in the final years of the Ray Shero, Dan Bilesma tenure, with guys like Tanner Glass populating the lineup way too much. Not that the fourth line or the bottom pairing makes a huge difference, but I think it does in the case of the Penguins more than most teams. They were playing a Blue Jackets team last night full of confidence and one that loves to forecheck. You need those puck movers to combat the forechecks, not brutes who can take a hit. Sure, Oleksy could hit, and he fought last night. I believe it was Boone Jenner, one of the most hard-charging Jackets forwards, but in the end, what difference did that make? And there was no protection of teammates going on in the case of Oleksy, which has been postured or postulated as the reason that a guy like Tom Sestito still occasionally gets an NHL sweater. Yes, Derek Pouliot's mistakes stood out the most, including a couple of big ones in coverage in the second period, but the Penguins should not be using these, as I mentioned, warm bodies like Oleksiy and Sestito unless absolutely necessary. And as I mentioned with Chad Ruhwedel on the big club, he was there, so it wasn't necessary to dress Oleksiy. One more injury, that might lead to a different situation. Sullivan said it himself during a bench interview in the midst of the Penguins' 7-2 win against the Rangers on Tuesday night on Root Sports. Bob Airey was doing the interviewing, and Sullivan said the Penguins, quote, need to attack in fives, groups of five, and Oleksiy is not going to be any part of an attacking group at the NHL level anytime soon or anytime in his career. Chad Ruhwedel could have been, and who knows, maybe a little extra help for Pouliot on that bottom pairing, Pouliot and Ruhwedel, which was the pairing Tuesday night. Maybe that helps the Penguins get out of their zone a little bit better, and perhaps it helps them stem the Jackets' tide in the second period, and things don't go as south as they did in the end. Remember, that game was up for grabs, not only through one, in which the Penguins had the edge in play, albeit slight, but also after two. It was just 3-1. We've seen the Penguins escape such deficits multiple times this season. Not a recipe for consistent success, but they can do it. However, without that depth up and down their lineup, some of that you couldn't help with the injuries to Letang and Daly, but I do think Ruhwedel would have made a difference. And even though it would have only been his second Penguins game, I liked his opportunity to do something positive over Steve Oleksiy. We'll never know if having the quicker, more skilled defenseman in there, along with Pouliot, helps Pouliot play his game too. So perhaps it was always the plan to play Oleksiy on the first night of the back-to-back and Ruhwedel Friday night against the Devils at PPG Paints Arena. But I didn't like the decision for Mike Sullivan, and I thought he got away from his game, to borrow a phrase from his predecessor, or one of his predecessors, Dan Bylsma. Let's wrap up the show. No ban the cliche. I'm in a holiday mood, so I'm not going to be too angry about lazy language this week. The final number will conclude this week's show, and I finally get to the Pirates news at the back end of the program after nearly an hour, but hey, we've got a lot on our plate this week on Gike's Got Game. But the final number is 32, as in the maximum millions of dollars the Pirates will owe Ivan Nova over the next 3 years. Yes, Ivan Nova has been signed by the Pirates. He will be retained, unlike Jay Happ last year, who underwent his own late-season transformation upon being dealt to the Pirates at the deadline. Happ went to the Blue Jays for 3 years and $36 million. Ivan Nova signs for what could end up being a minimum of $26 million, about $8 million a year in average annual value, plus a $2 million signing bonus. There are performance bonuses that go along with that could total up to 32, which again is my final number this week. But assuming Nova passes the physical, the Pirates will keep the guy that they rehab. They've had so many of these types of players leave them in these situations. Happ, I think, being the best example of that. A.J. Burnett left and then came back. He went to the Phillies, remember, and cashing in on his success with Ray Searage and the Pirates pitching program, which has done wonders for several pitchers over this decade. But Nova stays, and to me, Ivan Nova could have made at least $10 million more guaranteed on the open market, if not more, and if not more years. But I have to believe he wanted his agent, Greg Genske, who comes out looking not so good in this and not getting a lot for his client, just $26 million minimum, $32 million maximum over 3 years. In a very thin pitching market, I thought that would boost the Nova price up, but he apparently wants to stick in Pittsburgh. And I talked about this on 105.9 The X with my boss, Dejan Kovacevic, on Thursday. That's got to be the determining factor for me. He wanted to stay with his good buddy Francisco Cervelli from the Yankees organization. Those two have good chemistry. And Ray Searage. Searage spoke highly of Nova's ability to not only pitch with more confidence once he came to Pittsburgh, more first strikes, more in the zone, but also give some tips to the younger pitchers, and I think he'll be valuable in that regard. Nova's only 30 years old, but compared to what this rotation is projecting to be, he'll be by far the most experienced in 2017 in that rotation. And for as little as $8 million annually, I still can't get over that number. and that's the primary reason why the Pirates were able to pull this off. Charlie Morton, for goodness sake, the former Bucco, who only made 4 starts last year for the Phillies before his body failed him, he's getting almost as much. He's getting $7 million a year guaranteed from the Astros this season. So Charlie Morton, in an atmosphere in which Charlie Morton gets a multi-year deal at $7 million per, for the Pirates to get Nova at $8 million per, plus a little bit extra, we'll see how it pans out, is utterly remarkable. And I'm still blown away by the fact that they were able to not only keep him, but also keep him at that low discount rate. So a big win for Neil Huntington and the Pirates in an offseason in which they need one. Some bad PR after they tried to trade Andrew McCutchen. It could still happen, but I don't think it's going to happen this offseason. However, signing both Ivan Nova and I think a good bounce-back candidate in Daniel Hudson, the Arizona Diamondbacks reliever, and former 2-time Tommy John surgery recipient. Hudson, for the most part, has been good since he went to the bullpen in 2014, and so he's signed for $5.5 annually. Ivan Nova for $8 million annually. That adds up to $13.5. And why is that number important? Well, Francisco Liriano, who was dealt last offseason for financial flexibility explicitly by the Pirates and Neil Huntington, he's due to make $13.66666 million next year for the Blue Jays, just a little bit more than what the Pirates will be paying Ivan Nova and Daniel Hudson. They're 2 pitchers they signed this week. Factor in the signing bonus, it's a little bit more, but the numbers match up pretty well, and it's a very tidy narrative. Not all narratives are accurate, but in this case, it works out, and I think this is exactly what Huntington was talking about when he said financial flexibility. If he could get Nova in their budget constraints, then that would justify trading the struggling Liriano, who may bounce back in 2017. Who knows? But I think with Nova, the Pirates might have a better idea of what they're getting. Nova was much better in Pittsburgh. I mentioned the factors: more confidence, more first strikes, and generally more around the plate than he was ever in parts of 7 seasons with New York. Welcome back, Ivan Nova. We'll see you down in Bradenton in February. I'll see you next week on The River's Edge once again for another episode of Gike's Got Game. Thanks for watching and listening to not only this show, but also the new venture here that I've undertaken, Penn's Overtime. That's been great, too. I've always enjoyed pre- and post-game type of stuff, and especially post-game to sum up what just happened. We'll continue to endeavor to get insightful guests in addition to my commentary on Penguins games once a week here on The River's Edge. Until next time, this is Matt Gike saying, when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. Barreling toward Christmas and the New Year. I'll be with you one more time, though, in calendar year 2016. Talk to you later, right here from Millvale.